March 1856. The magnolia trees of Rowan County hung heavy with the perfume of early spring, their white petals gleaming like ghosts beneath a moonless sky. The plantation house of Colonel Nathaniel Harrow stood at the edge of that silence, a mansion of rotting pride, its walls whispering of wars fought and souls bought. What happens when a man builds his legacy not on honor, but on deceit? When the ink of his power is mixed with the blood of those who serve beneath him. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe so you never miss these haunting untold stories. Colonel Harrow had once been a name uttered with reverence. A decorated veteran, a man whose ancestors had carved their empire from the swamps and soil of the South. He inherited not only land but a dynasty, one whose wealth was measured in acres and lives. Yet beneath the chandeliers and bourbon glass toasts, a rot had begun. His estate, Blackthorn Hall, was known across the county for its grandeur, the sweeping verandas, the oak-lined drive, the scent of jasmine drifting from the gardens at dusk. But behind those walls, the Harrow family's reputation was beginning to unravel. Accounts were failing. Rumors spread that the colonel's debts had reached Charleston's creditors. Some said he had mortgaged even the silver spoons on which his children dined. And then there was the pact. No one outside the estate knew what had truly been signed in that candlelit parlor one storm-struck night. Only whispers reached the nearby towns, that the colonel had entered into an agreement with the men who once envied his power. An arrangement that would save his land but damn his soul. Those who worked the field spoke of strange visitors after midnight. Men arriving in carriages with no lamps, bearing documents sealed with black wax. The air around the mansion changed after that. Dogs whined without reason, candles extinguished themselves, and the house seemed to breathe uneasily, like something alive beneath its foundations. The colonel's wife, Eleanor Harrow, was the only person who ever dared question the change. She was once known as the Rose of Rowan, a woman of quiet intelligence and fragile grace. But by that year her beauty had begun to fade, not with age but with fear. At dinner one evening she watched her husband sign another set of papers by lamplight. His expression was calm, but his hand trembled as if he were writing against his will. "What debt could demand your soul, Nathaniel?" she whispered. He didn't answer. Only looked up slowly, his eyes hollow as an empty church. Later that night, Eleanor wandered the corridors of Blackthorn Hall. Her footsteps echoed across the checkerboard marble, and somewhere above her, she thought she heard a door close softly, though she knew every servant was asleep. When she reached the gallery, she paused before the family portraits. Each Harrow man stared down from the walls, their painted eyes accusing her husband of betraying everything they had built. And yet, in that flickering lamplight, Eleanor noticed something that had not been there before. In the portrait of Nathaniel's great-grandfather, the brushstrokes near the face seemed altered. The mouth, once fixed in pride, now seemed twisted into a faint sneer. A shadow curved where none should be. She blinked, shaken. When she looked again, the face was unchanged, yet the feeling lingered as though something within the painting was alive and watching. The next morning, the housekeeper, Martha, found Eleanor standing barefoot in the drawing room, staring out at the mist-covered fields. "They've started digging again," Eleanor murmured. "Digging, ma'am?" Eleanor turned to her. "Behind the stables. I saw them by lantern light. At least 6 men. And the colonel was with them." Martha crossed herself. "Ma'am, it's not our business to watch what he does at night." But Eleanor's voice hardened. "It is when the ground he's digging belongs to my family's graves." That night, she followed the glow of lanterns through the fog. The field grass brushed against her skirts, damp with dew. She crouched behind the old stone wall that bordered the graveyard, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Colonel Harrow and 2 men stood beside a freshly opened pit. In his hand, the colonel held a small black box, bound with an iron clasp. The men were murmuring something, a vow, perhaps, or a curse. Then the colonel dropped the box into the pit and covered it with earth. Eleanor could not hear their words, but she felt the air around her shift, heavy and suffocating. A wind rose from nowhere, blowing out the lantern flame. The men froze. The colonel looked up toward the dark tree line as if sensing eyes upon him. Eleanor pressed herself against the wall, heart hammering. When she looked again, the lanterns were lit once more, and the men were gone. Only the mound of disturbed earth remained. She didn't sleep that night. By dawn, her husband's carriage was gone, and she found a sealed letter upon the dining table, addressed to no one. The handwriting was unmistakable. His. Read. Asterisk. To those who find this, know that Blackthorn is no longer a house of the living. What has been promised cannot be undone. Guard the soil and the silence, for the debt is not yet paid. Asterisk. The ink trailed off, smudged as though by a trembling hand. From that day forward, something changed in the estate. The servants whispered that they could hear knocking beneath the floorboards at night. The livestock refused to cross certain paths near the stables. And every mirror in the house began to tarnish, slowly from the inside out, until the faces reflected in them seemed older, distorted, almost unfamiliar. When the colonel finally returned, his face was pale and gaunt. He dismissed anyone who asked questions. But Eleanor, sleepless and pale, would sometimes hear him speaking softly in his study, as though to someone who wasn't there. One night she pressed her ear against the door. And she heard her husband whisper, "You will have what was promised." The mansion of Colonel Nathaniel Crowhurst glowed like a wound against the black countryside. Inside, the air was heavy with bourbon, cigar smoke, and the sound of his boots dragging against the wooden floorboards. What began as a game of control, a cruel experiment in pride, had turned into something darker, something he no longer understood himself. Eleanor stood near the tall window draped in lace, her pale fingers gripping the curtains so tightly that her knuckles blanched. The voices of the 10 enslaved men echoed faintly from the courtyard, their chains glinting under the moonlight. They were strong, tall, and silent. Men who had built the very foundation of Crowhurst's wealth. Now they stood waiting for a command no man should ever have to obey. Nathaniel's reflection caught hers in the glass. "You think me a monster," he said, his tone strangely calm. "But every man with land and legacy must sometimes choose between decency and survival. You wouldn't understand." Eleanor turned slowly. "Survival?" Her voice cracked. "What part of this will save you, Nathaniel? Your soul? Your name?" He looked down at the parchment on the table, the document he called the agreement. Every word of it dripped with madness disguised as logic. It wasn't just about power. It was about proving that his bloodline could command not only men's labor but their lives, their bodies, even their lineage. The 10 slaves had been chosen not by chance but by strength, men he called the titans of my field. And his wife, Eleanor, was to be part of his proof. When the clock struck 11, the overseer entered. His hat in his hand, his eyes lowered. "They're ready, sir." Eleanor's breath hitched. "Please," she whispered, stepping forward. "You can still stop this." Nathaniel didn't look at her. "It's already begun." He poured himself a drink and gestured toward the door. "Bring them in." The sound that followed was unforgettable, the shuffle of chains, the murmur of disbelief, and the weight of despair filling the air. The men entered, one by one, their faces carved with exhaustion and quiet defiance. They had seen cruelty before but not this. Eleanor's eyes moved across their faces, not as slaves but as men. Men who had families somewhere or memories of freedom now buried under years of servitude. Her lips trembled as she spoke. "You are not to touch me." Nathaniel smirked. "No one will force you. But they will obey." He turned to his overseer. "Tell them what I've written." The overseer unfolded the parchment, his voice unsteady as he read aloud. "By order of Colonel Nathaniel Crowhurst, Mistress Eleanor Crowhurst shall be joined, in the name of this land's legacy, with 10 of the strongest field hands for the purpose of—" "Enough!" Eleanor screamed, her voice cutting through the room like lightning. "Enough!" Nathaniel slammed his glass on the table. "You think you're better than this house? Than the name you married into?" His voice rose with madness. "You were nothing when I found you, Eleanor, the daughter of a dying preacher with no dowry. You live under my roof. You breathe my air. You are mine." The silence that followed was thick and poisonous. Outside, thunder rolled across the dark fields. Then came a sound none of them expected: laughter. Soft, broken laughter from one of the enslaved men at the end of the line. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a scar running across his cheek. "You own nothing, Colonel," he said quietly. "Not her, not us, not even yourself. All you got left is your name, and tonight even that's dying." Nathaniel's hand went to his pistol. The overseer froze. Eleanor's eyes widened in terror. But before the colonel could lift the weapon, lightning split the sky, shaking the entire house. The room went dark. A single candle flickered, revealing only the outline of faces and fear. When the light steadied again, Nathaniel's gun was still in his hand, but his hand was shaking. He was no longer the man who owned the room. The shadows had shifted. Something unseen had entered with that thunder. Eleanor whispered, "Nathaniel, look." He turned toward the window. Outside, the fields burned faintly, torches moving like ghosts through the fog. Someone, or something, had surrounded the house. The overseer stammered, "Sir, it's the others. The rest of the hands, they're coming." Nathaniel's voice broke for the first time that night. They wouldn't dare. But they did. The night of the agreement had only just begun, and by dawn, no one in that mansion would see the world the same way again. The house that once ruled men's lives would soon bear witness to something far worse, the moment when every buried sin in the Crowhurst bloodline rose to collect its debt. And as the thunder rolled again over the plantation, Eleanor whispered a prayer that wasn't for forgiveness, but for justice. The storm did not pass that night. It deepened. By midnight, the Crowhurst plantation had turned into a living nightmare, a place where the screams of the past finally found their way through the walls. Rain lashed against the windows, thunder crawled through the air, and the firelight inside the great hall danced like the flicker of judgment itself. Eleanor Crowhurst stood by the window, her white gown soaked and trembling, while Nathaniel staggered toward the door, pistol in hand. The slaves had gathered outside, their torches lighting the night in defiance. They were no longer workers. No longer property. They were an army of memory. Every scar, every wound, every burial without a name had come back to stand before the master of the house. The overseer, trembling, whispered, "Sir, they've taken the fields, the stables. Even the guards are gone." Nathaniel's reply was a low snarl. "Then they'll burn with me." But his words betrayed him. His voice cracked not with rage but with fear. For the first time, the colonel saw the truth, not in his reflection, not in the flicker of firelight, but in the eyes of his wife. Eleanor was not afraid anymore. "Do you see it now, Nathaniel?" she said, her voice steady as the rain. "The land doesn't belong to you. It never did. It belonged to them, the ones who bled for it." Nathaniel pointed the pistol at her. His hand trembled, eyes wild. "You betrayed me." "No," she said. "You betrayed yourself." Outside, the heavy doors shuddered. A single blow rattled the hinges. Then another. The lock strained, the wood cracked, and with a deafening roar, the door burst open. A torrent of wind and rain swept in, carrying with it a dozen men, faces hardened by suffering, illuminated by fire. The man with the scar, the one who had defied Nathaniel before, stepped forward first. His name was Joseph. Eleanor stepped back, her eyes on him. There was no fear now, only recognition. Nathaniel fired his gun. The shot cracked through the hall, echoing like a scream. Joseph staggered but did not fall. The bullet had grazed his shoulder. Blood trickled down, but he kept walking, his gaze locked on the man who had stolen his life's every breath. "End this," Joseph said quietly. Nathaniel fired again. The pistol clicked empty. Eleanor whispered, "He can't." Joseph lunged, wrenching the pistol from the colonel's hand and flinging it into the fire. Then, in a single motion, he struck Nathaniel across the face. The great master fell against his own table, the table where he had signed the agreement. His glass shattered, and bourbon spread like blood across the paper, dissolving the ink, erasing the words that had condemned so many. Nathaniel tried to rise, but Joseph stood over him. "You wrote laws that made us less than men," Joseph said. "Tonight you answer to no law but your own." The house shuddered as if the walls themselves were breathing. The portraits of the Crowhurst ancestors stared down from the walls, their painted eyes flickering in the firelight. Eleanor turned to the others. "No one else dies tonight," she said. "Let him see what he's done. Let him live long enough to watch it burn." But Nathaniel did not listen. He pushed himself up, blood running down his temple, and staggered toward the grand staircase. "This is my house," he roared. "My land." Lightning struck the roof. Flames exploded through the rafters. The plantation that had stood for 3 generations began to collapse in upon itself. Joseph grabbed Eleanor's hand. "We have to go." She hesitated, glancing once more at Nathaniel. He was climbing the stairs, clutching at the rail, coughing through the smoke, shouting words that vanished in the roar of fire. He reached the landing, turned back toward her, and for a moment she almost thought he was the man she had once loved, the young soldier who built a dream before it rotted into cruelty. "Eleanor," he rasped, "help me." She shook her head slowly. "You made your choice, Nathaniel." The ceiling cracked. A beam fell. He disappeared beneath the flame. By dawn, nothing remained of the Crowhurst estate but ash and silence. The smoke rose over the fields where once men toiled under chains, and the wind carried the scent of freedom and loss in equal measure. Joseph and the others stood among the ruins. The air was still. The rain had stopped. He looked at Eleanor, who watched the sunrise through the broken columns of what had been her home. "What will you do now?" Joseph asked softly. She turned to him, her face streaked with soot and tears. "Bury the dead," she said. "And never let the living forget their names. 4 years to come, Travelers passing through that part of Tennessee spoke of the Crowhurst plantation as cursed ground. They said on stormy nights, one could still hear the sound of boots dragging across the old floors, or the crackle of fire whispering through the ruins. Some claimed a woman's voice could be heard singing a hymn through the rain, a lament for the lost and a warning for those who mistook power for divinity. The Crowhurst name faded from history, but the story did not. It lived on in the whispers of the freed, in the prayers of their children, and in the memory of a night when chains turned to fire, and justice came walking through the storm. The dawn after the fire was a strange, silver quiet. The fields of Crowhurst lay blackened, covered in ash and smoke, while the river reflected a sky that refused to turn blue. Everything that had once symbolized pride and power now rested in ruin, the grand balcony reduced to charred beams, the portrait hall burned to dust. Only the wrought iron gate stood untouched, like a skeletal witness to the fall of a dynasty. Eleanor Crowhurst sat beside the riverbank, her white dress torn, her hands still black from soot. She had not spoken since the night before. Joseph stood behind her, silent. Neither knew what came next. For people like him there had never been a next. For her there had never been a choice. The quiet was broken only by the faint crackle of cooling embers. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate. One of the freed men, Isaac, approached with a shovel. "We found him," he said quietly. Eleanor turned, her eyes hollow. "Nathaniel?" Isaac nodded. "Up near the stairs. Nothing left but the ring and the bones." Eleanor rose slowly, brushing ash from her skirts. "Bury him," she said. "But not here. Take him to the far field, where the others lie. Let him rest among those he built his empire on." Joseph looked at her, surprised. "You'd bury him with them?" "He lived off their backs," she murmured. "It's only right he faced them in death." The men exchanged glances, then began the grim task. The earth was still soft from the rain, and by noon Nathaniel Crowhurst was buried without ceremony, without prayer, beneath the same soil that had fed his wealth and swallowed his sins. When it was done, Eleanor remained by the grave. "He thought the world began and ended with his name," she whispered. "Now even the land won't remember it." Joseph spoke softly. "People will talk. They'll say you lost everything." She turned toward him, her eyes fierce despite her exhaustion. "They'll say what they want. But we didn't lose everything, Joseph. We found the truth." He nodded. "And what will you do now?" Eleanor glanced toward the smoldering ruins of the mansion. "Rebuild, not as it was. Not for me. For those who still live." In the weeks that followed, the freed men and women of Crowhurst built new cabins on the edge of the field. The air was different now, heavier but cleaner. The scent of smoke mixed with spring rain, and in that strange blend was the promise of something unfamiliar, peace. Eleanor worked beside them. She cooked, she cleaned, she learned the work her servants once did for her. Each day she shed a layer of who she had been. The townsfolk whispered, of course. They called her the widow of the ashes, the woman who slept among the people her husband once enslaved. But she did not answer them. She had stopped listening to gossip long ago. At night, the survivors gathered around a small fire in what used to be the overseer's yard. They told stories, not of pain but of survival. Joseph would speak of the first time he dared to look his master in the eye. Isaac told of the night he ran and came back, refusing to let fear define him. And Eleanor sometimes would tell stories of before, the laughter of her daughter, the way the piano sounded when she played in the parlor. But one night she spoke of Nathaniel. "He wasn't born cruel," she said. "He was made cruel. The land, the money, the lies, they teach a man to believe in his own holiness. And when you believe that, there's no room left for mercy." Joseph looked into the fire. "And what about you? What did they teach you?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "To stay silent. To obey. To look away." She paused, then added, "I won't do that again." The fire cracked softly. The night around them was filled with the hum of cicadas and the distant call of a whippoorwill. Months passed. Spring gave way to summer and life began to return to the scorched earth. Wildflowers sprouted along the paths where the slaves once carried water. The wind through the ruins of the great house sounded almost like voices, soft, whispering, remembering. Then one evening a stranger came riding through. He was a government official from Nashville, dressed in gray and carrying a book of records. He dismounted, looked around the rebuilt cabins and frowned. "Who's in charge here?" he asked. Eleanor stepped forward. "I am." The man looked startled. "Mrs. Crowhurst? You survived." "I did," she replied simply. He glanced toward the ruins of the mansion. "And your husband?" "Dead." The man scribbled something in his book. The property will need to be evaluated. Officially transferred. Eleanor crossed her arms. The property belongs to no one now. Let the land rest. He frowned. That's not how things work, ma'am. She met his gaze coldly. Then it's time they start working differently. The man hesitated, then left without another word. When he was gone, Joseph turned to her. You know they'll come back. I know, she said. But by then it won't be just me waiting for them. Years later, travelers would still speak of the Crowhurst lands. They said a woman lived there, pale and quiet, who spoke to ghosts and kept the graves clean. Some swore they saw torches at night moving between the ruins, figures walking in silence, guarding what little peace the dead had earned. Others said it wasn't ghosts at all, just the descendants of those who had survived, tending the soil, refusing to let the story fade. And in the town nearby, children were told a simple warning when they passed the old gate. Asterisk, don't forget what fire can do when it burns for truth. Asterisk. Because on that night in 1856, when the Crowhurst plantation burned to the ground, the world didn't just lose a house. It lost an empire built on silence. And in its place it gained something rarer, an echo that refused to die.